Committee meeting. I'm calling this meeting to order. My name is Marion Deerhank. I am recently appointed chair of this committee. Have a quorum. We are waiting for one other person that we know is coming, that we can go ahead and begin with some of the formalities. General Statute 138A-15 mandates that the chair inquire as to whether any member knows of any known conflict of interest or appearance of conflict with respect to matters before the commission. If any member knows of a conflict of interest or appearance of a conflict, please state so at this time. Hear none, so we can proceed. Maybe today, for those who are online, we are meeting at the Carteret Community College in Morehead City. We thank the college for hosting us today. It's always a great experience to meet remotely away from Raleigh and see what's going on in other parts of the state. I will, for the interest of those online, maybe go around the table and ask the members who are here to announce themselves and any visiting members to the committee meeting or not. So, Commissioner Harris, would you like to?
Oh, yes, Pat Harris, and I'm visiting today.
Jill Weiss, I am a member of this committee.
Donna Davis, I am a member of this committee.
Charlie Carter, member of the committee.
Robin Smith, an ex officio member of the committee.
Chair of the council,
Philip Reynolds, counsel to the commission.
Marion Deerhank, and
Mike Eversenskus, Director of DAQ.
sitting beside me. So thank you for being here, Director Representatives, and to the staff who came down from Raleigh today for this meeting. We have with one action item before us today, but before we get to that, we do have our meeting minutes from July that we need to review and approve. So have committee members read the draft minutes, and are there any comments, changes, or revisions, questions about the meeting minutes? Hearing none, I'd like a motion from someone to approve the meeting minutes for July.
Commissioner Davis, I will approve of the meeting minutes from July.
Commissioner Davis, may I have a second, please?
Commissioner Weiss, second.
Any other remarks about the meeting minutes? None. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those motion carries, and July minutes are approved. I will say that we have two members who cannot be with us today, but we do have a quorum presently, and one person is on the way. Commissioner Duggan and Dr. Lyerly, Commissioner Lyerly, both were unable to attend and send their regrets. I will take this opportunity to mention before we get into our action item that being at Carteret Community College reminds me of a longtime member of the Environmental Management Commission in the 1990s. His name is Will Fowler, and he was from Morehead City. And both he and his wife played very large roles in the establishment and support of this community college. So anytime I'm around the campus, I do think of Commissioner Fowler. He is deceased now, but we will always remember his long-time service on the commission. Okay, we begin with action items now. We have a request for approval of proposed rule revisions to proceed to EMC for approval to proceed to public hearing on revisions to 15A NCAC 02Q0802 gasoline service stations and dispensing facilities. And this will be presented by DMQ staff and equipment.
Thank you, Chair Deerhank. My name is Catherine Quinlan. I'm with the Division of Air Quality And I'll be presenting some proposed revisions to Rule 02Q 0802, and this is our gasoline service stations and dispensing facilities exclusionary rule. So I'll start with
Ms. Quinlan, can I make a real quick comment, a technology comment? We were told by Peter Johnson that there is a light above the camera, which is overhead of our screen. And the light is red, the microphones are off. But the camera is sensitive to each person speaking, although the screen will show what's on the PowerPoint. Anyone who is speaking will be shown in the upper right-hand corner of the viewers online. So just for your information. Thank you. Please go ahead.
All right, thank you. So just a slide with some acronyms that are used throughout the presentation. And so we presented a concept for this proposed rule revision back in May, but I'll go over some background information just to refresh commissioners. So our 02Q 800 rules are exclusionary rules. So the provisions in this section redefine particular facilities' potential emissions as actual emissions for certain industry classes. And that allows that type of facility to remain a minor source for Title V and HAPs as long as their actual emissions remain below the major source threshold. And so that's 100 tons per year of each regulated criteria pollutant, 25 tons per year of all hazardous air pollutants, and 10 tons per year of each individual hazardous air pollutant. And so this specific rule, 02Q 802, is for gasoline service stations and dispensing facilities. And it allows those types of facilities to remain exempt from permitting if their annual throughput remains below 15 million gallons. And that's calculated on a calendar month rolling average basis. So this rule was originally adopted and became effective in 1995. And that's when the 15 million gallon annual throughput threshold was determined and calculated. And it's based on emissions of a couple different types. So first we have underground storage tanks, and those result in emissions from filling, breathing, and emptying, and then refueling of vehicles on the station, both displacement losses and spillage losses. And then the rule also requires incremental reporting to the division. And so a facility that exceeds 10 million gallons has to report to the division annually, and then semi-annually once they exceed 13 million gallons. And then once the facility's throughput exceeds 15 million gallons, the facility has to submit a Title V permit application. So in 1994, just before this threshold was developed, EPA put forward standards for installation of onboard refueling vapor recovery, or ORVR technology, in new light-duty vehicles and light-duty trucks. And these were implemented in a phased approach. So it started with a requirement for the technology in 40% of new model year 1998 cars. And then the standards gradually were introduced over the years and increased those requirements to various portions of the fleet. And that was determined by the vehicle type and model year. And then by 2006, nearly all new gasoline-powered highway vehicles were required to be equipped with this technology. By 2012, EPA determined that the technology is in widespread use throughout the motor vehicle fleet, and it controls motor vehicle refueling emissions. And then as we continue throughout time, these older vehicles without the technology are going to continue to be replaced with newer vehicles that have the technology. And so that portion of the fleet with technology is going to continue to increase. So specifically, this technology in the vehicle fleet reduces the vehicle refueling displacement component of that total emissions calculation from these gasoline service stations. And as the percentage of the vehicle fleet with this technology increases, so does the maximum amount of gasoline that the facilities can dispense while keeping the actual emissions below those major source thresholds we saw a couple slides ago. So the DAQ is proposing an increase to the annual throughput limit in 215A in CAC 02Q 0802 to incorporate the presence of this vapor recovery technology in the vehicle fleet and current AP 42 emission factors. So the DAQ looked at the phased-in EPA requirements and recent registration data from 2017 to 2020 in North Carolina and applied those phased-in requirements to that registration data for North Carolina's fleet, and found that approximately 85% of the state's light duty vehicles and light duty trucks would be equipped with this technology. And that number, what we also saw over that time period, is that it continues to increase as well. So by now it might be more than 85%. But based on 85% of the fleet in North Carolina having this technology, the analysis indicated the recalculated threshold to remain a non-insured will be 52 million gallons. So these are the revisions that we're proposing in the rule, really just replacing that 15 million gallon maximum threshold with 52 million gallons. And then, as I mentioned before, in subparagraph E1 and E2, we have some reporting thresholds. So currently the 10 million annual reporting threshold and 13 million gallon semi-annual reporting thresholds are proposed to increase to 45 million and 50 million gallons. And so, as I mentioned, this recalculated threshold of 52 million gallons reflects that 85% of the fleet that would have the technology to recover vapors when being filled, and then 85% control of that 85% of the fleet. So potentially impacted facilities would include any gasoline station or dispensing facility with a throughput that exceeds the current threshold of 15 million gallons, but is lower than the proposed threshold of 52 million gallons. So these are the facilities that would, their type of permit class would change, the facility class would change. So there are currently 4 gasoline stations in North Carolina that hold synthetic minor permits. And so these facilities have a throughput greater than 15 million gallons or very close to it. And so they obtained synthetic minor permits over the last several years. But their throughputs are below 52 million gallons. And so upon these rule revisions becoming effective, they would no longer need to hold those synthetic minor permits in order to avoid Title V permitting requirements. And then there's also one additional gasoline station that's currently reporting to us that is expected to submit an application for a synthetic minor permit very soon. And so we also assume that they would be holding a synthetic minor permit by the time these rule revisions became effective. So we based our fiscal analysis on 5 facilities that will hold a permit, but upon the rule revisions becoming effective would no longer hold a synthetic minor permit. And so the types of fiscal impacts to the private sector include savings in the annual permit fee, the fee that the facility pays for holding a synthetic minor permit. And then savings in labor for activities related to holding that permit or demonstrating compliance with that permit. And so that's preparing an annual malfunction report and then preparing a permit renewal application and emission inventory, which occurs every 8 years for synthetic minor. And then impacts to the state in DAQ would include reduced revenues from not receiving those permit fees from those 5 facilities, and then savings in labor for activities related to ensuring compliance with the synthetic minor permit. And so that includes an annual inspection, reviewing that annual malfunction report, and then every 8 years for each facility, reviewing that renewal application and emission inventory submittal. So this table shows, this is table 6 from our fiscal analysis, regulatory impact analysis rather, sorry. And it shows the time period that we use and the different types of costs and savings that we estimated for private sector and state government. We chose an 8-year time period to evaluate because they're on an 8-year renewal cycle, so we could capture each type of cost in the analysis period window. And what we can see is that the private sector is estimated to have savings every year. The DAQ does show a net cost primarily due to that reduction in revenue for the first 3 years, but then as those renewal applications come up, then the DAQ is also experiencing savings. So the overall net present value over the 8-year window, when discounted at 7% in 2023 dollars, is about $83,500. So we presented the concept for this rule revision in May. Here we are in September requesting approval from the AQC to proceed to the EMC. If we receive that today, we would anticipate requesting approval from the EMC in November to proceed to public hearing, holding a comment period and hearing towards the end of this year and beginning of next year. And then following the timeline, we're anticipating an effective date next summer. And so the director recommends that the committee approve the proposed amendments to 15A and CAC 02Q 0802 and accompanying regulatory impact analysis to proceed to the EMC or approval to proceed to public comment. And with that, I can take any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions? I have a few questions, but I wanted to give the other members an opportunity to speak first. Anyone? I let Ms. Quinlan know ahead of time I had some of these questions, so maybe she's had a chance to look into some of it. The change from 10 to 15 million for reporting to 45 or 52. One would have expected that it made state proportionally the same, 67%, but now being 45 and 52, that's more of the area of like 86%. So why the change?
So these thresholds, the reporting thresholds, you're right, they're not the exact same ratios as the previous 10, 13 to 15. They are very similar to the same increments that they were before, being 2 million in between the semi-annual reporting threshold and the maximum, and then previously it was 5 million in between the annual reporting to the maximum, and now it's the total of 7 million. And the thought is that this is enough capacity for the facility to have warning that they may be approaching the threshold, for the DAQ to have warning, and for us to really know who kind of close that gap in between the reporting thresholds and the maximum throughput. So we kind of know when these facilities are approaching this threshold, whereas there may be a facility that sits in between. I think if we were to go with about 67% for the annual reporting threshold, it'd be about 35 million gallons. And there may be a facility sitting between 35 and 52 for some time. But rather this allows us to close that gap and know who's getting really close to that threshold. That was kind of the thought behind that.
So there are really only 5 facilities that are requesting this, or that are these the only 5 subject to it, or are they just the 5 who requested it?
So they're the 5 facilities that we have identified that have synthetic minor permits or are expected to have synthetic minor permits. We don't have any facilities that of this type that hold Title V permits that just exceed the 15 million and valid Title V permit. So these are the 5 that we're aware of that have and said we're getting close to the 15 million, or we're exceeding it, and so we don't want to get a Title V permit. So we're going to instead, what they actually have to do under the rules is request to not be subject to the 800 rules to 802, and then get synthetic minor permit as like an alternative option. So these are the 5 that we know of. The one that is expected to submit soon is currently reporting. I'm aware of it in that manner, but we're not aware of any others that have this type of capacity.
So these are probably 5 of the largest flow throughs of all stations in the state. That's what we're hearing. And you say there's something pending, there's a permit application or conversation going on with pending, just so.
So when we were developing the fiscal analysis, we were reviewing if anyone's currently reporting, getting close to the current 15 million, where they might potentially be impacted by this rule as well. And there's one that is reporting and exceeding the 13 million, I believe. And they indicated that they are getting close to the 15 million, and so they are expecting to submit a permit application soon. This was several weeks ago, so.
But when new facilities come around, and we are expecting some mega facilities, I think, to be built in the future, they will be obligated to come ahead of construction or ahead of operation and notify you of this anticipated trigger for their permit.
So if the facility, if these rule revisions become effective, then if the facility is greater than 52 million, they would have to get Title V, right? 52 million gallon throughput threshold annually. They have to get a Title V permit. If they're below 52 million, then they can be excluded under these rules and keep records that they are in compliance with that throughput. throughput threshold, and thus they are not required to get a Title V permit under.
And local programs such as the Charlotte metropolitan area, I understand you've spoken with them and they did not have any facilities affected by this change.
That's correct. We did verify with the facilities that are with the local programs that if they would adopt these higher thresholds, after the state adopts them, then they don't have any current facilities that are holding synthetic minor permits that would be impacted, such as these 5. One did indicate that they have been contacted by a large company about increasing the thresholds. But again, that's not one that's currently holding them. Interested in the outcome.
And I noticed that for this methodology, the division assumed $2023 for dollar value. But I've seen other years referenced for dollar value recently for other RIAs. What's the, I'll ask maybe Director Brzezinski, what's the division's policy of which year to use for dollar?
For staff on that.
So it really, we work with OSBM to determine what the most appropriate dollar value is, given the year we're performing it, and also the types of costs we're estimating, what our time period window looks like, what the baseline of our analysis is. For some, where we might have conducted some sort of modeling or something, sometimes those models will give us outputs in a certain dollar value. And so rather than converting those, we would leave it as a dollar value when we're working with OSBM, if that's determined. In this case, we did use $2023 because the starting year is 2024 of our analysis. And so some of the costs that we're looking at, particularly labor costs and such, some of the costs were nominal values, some were $2023. And so we just had to convert, we had to go one way or the other, basically convert the nominal to 2023. We'll convert also some other dollar value, and so it made no sense since some were already in $2023 to use that as the basis.
I have 2 or 3 more questions, but let me
Well, if you
stop
want
there.
to finish now,
Okay.
you triggered one for me, and I think they're.
Okay, all right. The state air toxic air pollutants, what about them? And are they, how are they being handled in this context?
So we have air toxic pollutant permit procedures in section 02Q0700. And so that does specify the emission rate thresholds for when a facility would need to get a toxic permit, air toxics permit. These facilities, well, I should also say, well, 02Q702 also contains a list of facilities that are excluded from that requirement, and gasoline stations and dispensing facilities are considered one of those excluded facilities. However, they are still required to be in compliance with the stage 1 vapor recovery requirements. I think it's rule 2D928. And so they're still inspected, and there's still some oversight on the facilities, and they do have to have some.
Subject to federal things.
And these facilities understand this, don't they? They still have obligations in the state air toxics. And just 1 or 2 more questions. This change came about with a revision to AP 42, the emission factors document that EPA publishes, its peer-reviewed document based on national studies. Does the state feel confident that the AP 42 emission factor for this facility is validated with monitoring studies? I understand there might be some monitoring studies out that contradict some of the AP 42 assumptions or choices of numbers.
So I personally am not aware of studies contradicting these. I haven't come across those. However, I mean, we typically, in both, just speaking generally, it's not uncommon to use AP42 factors in permitting practices, as well as determining regulatory thresholds such as this. So, you know, I'm not aware of any studies that kind of would allude to those factors not being appropriate. We use the same methodology in the past, but rather the factors have and assumptions have been updated to reflect the technology and just the current factors in AC42. But this particular component that we're making a change to the displacement, fuel displacement emissions. I mean, effectively, it's assuming, it does assume an uncontrolled emission factor from the AP42, and then to 85% of that applies to 98% control, and then to 15% of it does not apply control. It remains uncontrolled. But yes, the basis is still an uncontrolled factor. We obtain from the
Well, I know we're glad that the technology has improved and that we're even brought to a position where we can make some sort of decision about this. But those are just a few questions that I wanted to put forward. Yeah. Commissioner Carter.
Yeah, if I could follow up with a couple of something, I want to make sure I understand this. Because fundamentally what we're doing is we're exempt these folks from synthetic minor permitting, but you said a minute ago that if they're over 52 million tons, they would be subject to a Title V permit.
So what these exclusionary rules do is they actually do not, and it's actually written in 2Q801, they do not exclude facilities from the state permitting program. They exclude them from Title V permitting. However, it does not change any requirements in the state permitting program. However, these types of facilities are then exempt from the state permitting program. And so they don't have to obtain, if they're under the threshold that's established in this rule, don't have to obtain a state permit. These facilities, what they have chosen to do, because currently, as written in the rule, the two options are be excluded under 2Q802 by being under 15 million gallons or get a Title V permit. But there is one provision that allows them to say they do not want to be subject to 2Q802, and that allows them to apply, basically it opens up this third option to apply for a synthetic minor permit, basically a state permit, but with additional provisions to make sure they are remaining a minor source.
Well, what I'm getting at here mainly is what's the figure for 52 million in Title V? Is it 100 tons? Is it 25 tons?
The 52 million reflects a VOC rate just below 100 tons per year of VOCs, and that is the main component we're looking at. And we also verified that the HAPs are far below those thresholds as well.
Okay. Another one is, and you mentioned this a minute ago, is that these facilities would still be subject to 928. It's the stage 1 requirements. But they would not have a permit that imposes those. They'd simply be required to meet the 928 requirements generally, correct? Now, and I was looking back at 928, one thing in here that I'm not quite clear on, 928 is title is gasoline service station state 1. But when you read down through this thing, it doesn't apply just to service stations. It applies to any gasoline dispensing facility. And it doesn't look like there's any kind of a threshold or anything. But exempt very small facilities, so that let's sweep in an awful lot, potentially an awful lot of mom and pop outfit that has a tank that fills up their delivery truck or something. Am I correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
So those folks being subject to this and inspected and so on.
Yes.
Well, I guess not always something that we need to take a closer look at this. I'm not really clear on why that should be applied in this manner to really small facilities. And it may be that we need to think about further extension to those kinds of facilities.
Related to the stage 1,
The dispensing facilities.
the dispensing facilities being
Service stations, that's, I guess that's part of the federal rule. Dispensing facilities, I'm not so sure about that. sure quite where that comes from, especially it's seems to be applied to simply the service station.
When you say applying, I'm just trying to clarify, applying specifically to service stations, you're referring to the 802?
No, 298 or 920.
920.
Yeah.
Not sure, I would have to, I don't have it in front of me.
No, I understand that. This is like, I think a question, not a question. I think that from today, I it's a good change for 802, but I think this 928 we need to take a hard look at it moving forward.
I would have to look at that.
I think the only other question that I had about the RIA is it referenced in Roman numeral 4 in the proposed rule, it referenced that the rule change concerns setting new maximum throughput in direct CD calculated on a monthly rolling. This is just a broader question, I suppose. Is the monthly rolling average appropriate for an air quality topic that is seasonally sensitive, ozone season? Does that make sense? I mean, do you understand what I'm saying?
I do understand what you're saying, and from an ozone perspective, that might be something where it needed to be looked at more seasonally. I think for the purposes of this rule, we're simply ensuring compliance with the major source thresholds, which are on an annual basis. And so this rule is very specific to, it's not really pertaining to demonstration with the ozone max or anything along those lines. There are separate.
But they are linked.
They are, sure. And so I think, yeah, probably the scope of this one is just so narrow that it's focusing on just simply those major source thresholds. That's something I'll have to pull closer.
Yes, Director Evans, yes.
If I may, Madam Chair, also note that that in our environment here in North Carolina and the Southeast, anthropogenic VOCs contribute very little to ozone formation, and so that matter may not be critical from an ozone season consideration.
Thank you. Well, just as a reminder, this is a request to propose this rule for the public's comment. And if there are no other questions, do members have any requests for any changes, clarifications to the rule before taking this to a vote for public comment? I see no hands raised. Oh, yes, Commissioner Weeks.
Thank you, Commissioner Deerhake. I was a little slow in getting my hand up, but this question springs from one that you raised, and that is right now it's a very small number of facilities that are affected, but I believe Chairman Deerhake indicated that there might be additional facilities that could be impacted by this coming online. Am I understanding that correctly? And if so, how many?
Well, sure. So I don't think we're aware of like a significant number of, at least I'm personally not, of, large gas stations that are, imminently moving into North Carolina. If a very large one opened up, we would of course have to check if it's first greater than this threshold, and then it would be subject to Title V regardless. And if it's not, then yeah, under the current rule, let's say its threshold is between, or its throughput is estimated between 15 million and 52, our current and our post threshold, then basically they would be impacted because they would not need to request either. I mean, I think we would assume they would probably request a synthetic minor permit rather than just go with the Title V. They would not need to do that and, pay that application fee. I think it's about $400 for the first time, synthetic minor permit, and prepare those applications labor for that. So they would be impacted by not ever having to get a synthetic minor permit. But, we didn't include that in our fiscal analysis just simply because we don't know. I think we've heard of maybe one very large one coming. There have been some news reports about that, but I don't think anything is firm, and so we didn't include that estimation. But sure, they would be impacted by not having to do what these other 5 facilities have had to do over the last several years.
Thank you.
So RIAs typically, or fiscal notes typically don't project growth in the industrial sector.
I think it typically depends on the nature of the revision and the facilities. There are some particularly very complex analysis where there's a lot of expected change in certain sectors, such as, let's say, the electricity generating sector, or the transportation sector from the side of like what the vehicle fleet actually looks like. But in this case, I think we're typically our baseline is what is happening, what we expect to be happening when these rule revisions become effective. Which we expect there to be 5 facilities by summer of next year that hold synthetic mining permits. And then we're just evaluating those 5 facilities. But there is uncertainty associated with if there's any other facilities that would be coming to North Carolina within, let's say, the 8-year period that we looked at, they would also experience savings. But that would just add to the savings that are estimated in this fiscal analysis. Because the private sector is only estimated with savings.
And that's another thing that comes to mind. This AP 42 emission factor, is it almost like an area source emission factor, or is it strictly the pumping? Does it capture comprehensively all the potential emissions coming from the station?
So there's actually several different factors that are used in the calculation. As the AP 42 kind of table that we look at has different factors for the different activities that we went over, the different components. If I can find so under the second bullet, where we list the different types of emissions that result, and that factor into this calculation. So we have actually different factors for the filling, the breathing, the emptying, the refueling displacement losses in this village. Now, this particular ORVR requirement technology affects that refueling displacement loss calculation. And so that's the one that we're really narrowing in on, is that, when the 98% control to the 85% and no control to 15% of the fleet without the technology. But there are other factors for the other types of emissions that result, that all factor into this calculation.
Do these facilities that are seeking relief understand that they're obligated to monitor, not physically necessarily monitor, but to comply with any other emissions that are coming and how they might trigger compliance?
When you say other emissions, are you referring to these other components?
Spillage, billing, breathing.
So those are all factored into how we determine the 52 million. So we calculated 52 million is what reflects out of all these components.
But the AP 42 number is only for refueling displacement loss.
There are AP 42 factors for the different components, different factors. AP 42 provides a factor for refueling displacement losses that are uncontrolled. And then we, apply the controlled and uncontrolled emissions to those. And then it also contains a factor for spillage and for the tank breathing, et cetera.
So the analysis considered all of those emissions.
That's correct, yeah.
Thank you. If there are no other comments or questions, welcome action by the committee, one way or the other. Is the committee ready to take this as a proposed rule? Thank you. We have a motion with Commissioner Carter to take it as a proposed rule for public comment. That includes the fiscal. Always need to tag that on, don't we? Okay. Second by Commissioner Davis. Any other discussion on this topic? All those in favor? Let's take a voice vote since we're working remotely today. Commissioner Weeks,
Aye.
Commissioner Davis, or Commissioner Carter,
Aye.
as our ex officio chair for today. We have 4 out of, well, do we count our ex officio? Okay, so we have 4 out of 7 members present. So we of the 4. So we have a majority of the quorum present, so the motion carries. So, thank you. Job. Welcome, Commissioner Bailey. And you have you and Todd. Thank you for being here.
Rain, traffic, and
We're glad to bring you up today on our activities. We are at the informational item stage of the agenda. We're not doing business before the EMC tomorrow. So we turn to Director Abrazinskis for any remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, everyone. A few quick updates this morning. There are a few resource links at the bottom of the agenda for the committee for the request of the chair. So those should be good resources from the topics of our ambient air monitoring data and our compliance data and some of our permitting data as well. So feel free to take a look at those links and glad to provide those for you. A quick staffing update for the Division of Air Quality. We are doing a little better on vacancies, I'm happy to report. For the first time in a while, we're down to 22 vacancies in DAQ. We're happy to announce the hiring of our new Raleigh Regional Office Supervisor, Dawn Reddix, who was an engineer in that office prior to being promoted. So we're excited for Dawn. And I'll note one area of particular concern right now is our permitting section, where we will have, as of October 1, so a few weeks from now, 6 vacancies in our permitting section. So that's an area of focus for us in the near term. I'll give one other brief update on the topic of startup, shutdown, and malfunction SIP call. This is an informational item y'all heard 2 meetings ago at the May meeting. Joelle Burleson provided an update on that topic. Since then, we've continued to have discussions with EPA on that matter and about how best to resolve the proposed SIP call that they proposed earlier this year. EPA has made it clear that there is a path forward, and we are in agreement on a path forward of simply submitting the previously approved original startup shutdown malfunction rule by the commission to EPA for review and approval into the SIP, with the exception of the 2 paragraphs that they have concerns about for the subject of the SIP call. That's paragraphs C and G. And so many other air quality programs across the nation are taking that approach. We're working with EPA now to get us on a similar path to resolve this issue. And we're hopeful that if we can do that very soon and get that submitted into EPA very soon, we have a chance to avoid being included in the final SIP later this year, right? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. There are no changes to the rule. It's the rule that this commission has previously approved.
Well, if you're excluding those 2 provisions,
We aren't excluding them from how we implement the rule. The rule will remain on the books as is. We will implement it as it's written. It's just that those 2 paragraphs of that rule will not be included into the federally approved SIP. That's the only change. So it has no practical impact on implementation day to day. So that is the approach we have discussed with EPA, and again, several other states have already taken this approach, and they've been approved here in the last 6 months by EPA. And I also know 2 of our local programs are taking the same approach on the same schedule to resolve this matter and hopefully avoid being included in that final SIP call that may be on track to be issued by the end of the year. So time is of the essence for us to go ahead and act and get that submitted into EPA.
Well, I'm certainly in favor of get this thing, all that's, does seem awesome.
With that, Madam Chair, that's all for today. I'll save the rest of my remarks for tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. I have no closing remarks, just to point out other resources that are available in the agenda for you to view about status of the work being done in the committee and by the division. Any comments or remarks from the committee members? Council? If none, then this meeting stands adjourned. Our next meeting is scheduled for November. Thank you.